Hello and welcome back to another episode of Futures Frame TV. I'm Melise Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel, and I'm here today with Rowland Atkinson. Rowland Atkinson is an expert in cities, in urban studies and planning, as his department is called at the University of Sheffield. Welcome, Rowland, to the program.
Thanks, Alice. Great to be here.
We are very happy to have you here. We're very excited about what you are hopefully going to tell us about the concentration of wealth in cities, which is what you're studying and what you're an expert on. And you recently wrote a book, which is called Alpha City. Could you tell us a little bit about what the Alpha City is and what the book is about?
Yeah, so Alpha City is a reference to, essentially it's looking at what is considered to be one of the richest cities in the world, and it's trying to say something about how this kind of system works as a totality, how it all kind of fits together. So it's a profile of the wealth elite, the richest people who live in the city, and it's also a study, if you like, of the politics, the homes, the locations, the neighborhoods, but also the kind of mobilities as well, the things that sort of stitch this thing together, both in terms of kind of private jets, the driving around, the private cars, the mega mansions. And it's a story essentially about, I suppose, how, the subtitle of the book is How London Was Captured by the Super Rich. So really what it's trying to say is there's an argument here. It's not just that this is a very wealthy city, it's one that has been captured by the wealthy, that they exert a kind of influence over the political life of the city. They exert a particularly strong influence over what kind of buildings get constructed in the city. And the final step of that argument is to say that all of that is quite problematic for ordinary people who live in the city, who see a place that is increasingly being sort of made over for the wealthy. That, for example, public housing has been demolished. Many units of public housing have been demolished. We've had an austerity regime that has cut welfare. And at the same time, we've seen massive numbers of both the existing rich of the city and many people from overseas as well, buying property, coming to live in the city. And the big question really at the back of all of that is that a good thing, ultimately?
Is that a good thing, ultimately?
Well, my take on it, my analysis would be that no, that is a problem. That in the same way, for example, some people have said that oil wealth was a curse on many countries in Africa and elsewhere. It kind of hollowed out those societies. It meant that money cascaded upwards to the existing elites in those societies. Actually, what you see in London is what some people refer to as a kind of finance curse. So this kind of wealth economy of the rich on the one hand, and the City of London, which is one of the key global players, obviously, in terms of flows of capital and so on. Has that benefited the city? Yes, of course. It's impossible to say that is, that doesn't deliver in some sense. But at the same time, it's a more complicated story than that. So part of this is about the creation of spaces which help to sort of, I would say, sort of insulate the wealthy from the social inequalities of London. That if you're very wealthy, you can hide away in parts of the city which are very beautiful, very attractive. You exist on this kind of wonderful circuit of events, a social scene. You can be transported around in ways that allow you to kind of ignore the poverty and the problems of the city. So that's kind of one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that it's a problem because of a lot of the kind of organized criminality, the money laundering and so on, which we know is a really big deal. So we know that, for example, that the national economy, the British economy, is the recipient of roughly 100 billion pounds worth of laundered money annually. And there are estimates, for example, that well over 100 billion pounds worth of London property is owned offshore by kind of suspicious sources of finance. And so there's a really big question about how sustainable is all of this? How much have property prices been artificially inflated? Which has a much broader impact. That impacts on everyday Londoners who are probably paying an estimated £20,000 to £30,000 more for their property as a result of the inflation of property by criminal capital and by overseas buyers and all the rest of it. Anyway, this is all a kind of very big, complicated story. But what's happening really is that there's a kind of theft of the everyday city, and there's the ability of a kind of policy making elite to say, look, these people have really helped the city economy. They've brought money to it when we've gone through austerity, when we had the last financial crisis and so on. I'm sure you saw these debates in Mexico. We need the rich, they deliver, this money trickles down and all the rest of it. And what I think is increasingly evident is that that was a pretty hollow proposition. And what actually happened was many of those people benefited for themselves, but there's a real question about the degree to which that wealth diffuses through the city in ways that benefit ordinary, working, and indeed poorer households in the city.
It's very interesting that you bring up terms like theft and criminality and segregation, which are probably usually terms associated or traditionally more associated with lower socioeconomic background neighborhoods of cities where there's ghettoization, where there's crime, where there's theft of public space, etc. And now we shift these concepts into rich neighborhoods, this concentration into something.
There's a lot going on there, actually. And I think we're seeing more and more this kind of, one could say, a kind of reversal or an inversion of the kind of traditional perspectives around, what's criminal, what's problematic, what is destabilizing, what is disordering the city, that where we see money laundering happening, fraud in the city of London, which is in, many tens of billions of pounds annually. In fact, we know that some of those banks operate and connect with criminal organizations in countries like Mexico, for example. We know that HSBC was involved in that significantly. Anyway, that's another story. But aside from some of that kind of stuff, yes, there's a real question about looking up, looking at our elites, looking at, in a critical way, at the life of politics. So we know from a recent report about Russian involvement in the British political system that the British government did very little about that. It wasn't interested in that. And now we have all kinds of questions being asked about who's being given a lord, being made a lord to sit in the House of Lords in the British Parliament, who's controlling the city's newspapers, the news media system, the control and ownership of the major sporting teams and so on. And all of that kind of begins to look a bit rotten. And with the kind of exposés of various NGOs, for example, Oxfam, Transparency International, and then the other work of really great sort of investigative journalists like Oliver Buller, Nicholas Shaxson, people like that, what they have identified is a really significant system of criminal activity that particularly operates in relation to the offshore finance system, which has been a really significant element or a mainstay of the British economy in the post-war period and the post-colonial period, where the country was kind of looking around for what did it want to specialize in? How was it going to sort of win out in this, increasingly globalized economy? Well, what we find is that sort of what's been described as a kind of spider's web of offshore holdings, much of that money flows back formally into the city of London. Much of it flows into, the purchase of mega homes particularly in the new large alpha Uber kind of developments in the city core. So it looks rotten, it looks problematic. And we also know that not much attention is being paid to that by the people that should be. So, of course, the politicians on the one hand who are setting the regulatory framework and not really doing much about that. There is a sense of a lack of interest in questions of money laundering. We know that the National Crime Agency is pretty underfunded, and they've been very critical of London as one of, if not the worst, hubs for criminal money laundering globally, but does not have the resources to do something about this. So we know, for example, that there's a particular woman who I don't need to mention who was pursued by the National Crime Agency through something called an unexplained wealth order. And she has spent the equivalent of over about 10 years of roughly £100,000 a month in Harrods. And, it took an immense effort by the National Crime Agency to try and do something about this. But this is just one case where, a home was bought for £9 million in Knightsbridge. By the mid 2010s, it's worth 15 million and so on. So individual people becoming very wealthy, benefiting from this, because quite often the strategy with money laundering is you really put as much as you can into the property. You're trying to get rid of cash, as it were, temporarily, and then sort of reclaim it potentially later on as it's integrated into the formal economy. Well, all of that stuff kind of stinks, really, and this is a country that sort of supposedly lives by a rule of law, you know, great deal of secrecy and probity around people's personal arrangements. But the downside of that is we don't pay enough attention to the more problematic practices. And there's a kind of sense almost of anarchic space, that this is slightly lawless. I mean, we know that around 14 or more Russians, just to take one notable example, have been killed in London and beyond. So we've had these cases where there is this sense of lawlessness, of real kind of problems at the top end, and a sense that at the very top there's a real insecurity. So one of the things that I go into in quite a lot of detail in the book is the way that anxiety and paranoia about who you associate with, how safe your home is, how safe your investments are, all of those kind of things begin to develop a kind of mentality amongst the rich, which sort of shuts things down, which creates a more fortified aesthetic to the private home. So people really living in spaces where, they've got CCTV, they've got biometric security systems, they've got safes, they've got systems like, if a burglar enters the property, it's possible for this smoke to immediately fill the entire home in less than 10 seconds, which means that you can't see what you're trying to steal. Very, very complex, very advanced systems begin to emerge. But the key point to make about that is that we're talking about London. We're not talking about, shall we say, a gated community in the Latin American environment where we know that questions of security, disorder, burglary, all of those kind of, and violence more common. So the look and the feel of the city, which is traditionally very open, very aesthetically inviting, I would say, very public in that sense, begins to be characterized more by gates and booms, private guards, and these kind of more high-tech security systems. So there are stories of people having their own kind of security detail who kind of lock down the street so that these people can get into their home before they then open the street again. And all of that, changes the character, the feel of the city, but it also makes it a more private and, shall we say, sort of more anxious space that is quite at odds, I would say, with where the city has come from in the past.
Do you think that this secrecy has something to do with their success, let's say, in keeping or in building these structures? Because if it were more publicly known or visible, maybe it would cause more outcry, or does that not matter at all?
I think the privacy is something that has historically gone alongside money. So certainly in the largest homes, you would find high walls, you would find more basic security systems than we see currently. So there's always been that kind of history of, shall we say, privacy, status, prestige, and so on. That's always kind of gone together. The ability to control your own space, to control your own affairs, to have your own secretary, and so on. But here we're talking about quite significant changes in the look and feel of streetscapes. So we can go to inner parts of the north of London, say, where people do things like they buy two very large mansions and they knock both of them down. They create a much larger space. They install electronic gating. They may have personal security staff. There's questions about the preservation of that environment, in historical terms, the loss of really quite beautiful homes, which are no longer seen to be good enough, big enough, and all the rest of it. So there's a kind of hyper privatization that goes on. And I have, colleagues who have also done studies of how, for example, some of the very large homes that were associated with the historically wealthy in, say, the late 19th, early 20th century were actually quite integrated with the community. So they would have things like parties, open days, fetes, and so on, where the community was invited into the grounds of the home. There was a greater sense of connection between the very wealthy and the communities that they were part of. And I think there's something of the character of the new money, which is more withdrawn, a little bit more anxious, and sees a stronger association between prestige and achievement and privacy than was there traditionally. And some of that varies by the national background that people are coming from. People from certain jurisdictions are more anxious and more withdrawn than others. And they also look for different aspects of the city in terms of, do they want to live in a very expensive apartment type building if perhaps they've come from Hong Kong, say, Or if they're used to living in a very large residence, let's say they're from the Middle East or somewhere like that, then they will look to another part of the city. So you get this kind of a sense of these different, we might say, sub-tribes of the super rich. And there's a kind of social geography to that. They live in different parts of the city. And some of that's historic. You know, Russians in the inner north of London, Arabs in places like Chelsea and the West End historically from the 1970s onwards who brought their oil wealth and so on. And now the story is more diverse and it's changing in terms of things like the obvious stuff like information technology, gambling systems, various kind of utilities in places like Russia and elsewhere that have been privatized, in Mexico maybe, I'm not sure, which have produced these sort of stellar winners, individual winners who then have enormous money power to go in and buy these kind of mega homes. And most of them are looking to be in the West End of London, but the geography is more complex than that. Some of it's actually beyond London. So I do talk a little bit in the book about these very, you have gated communities and very large homes, stately homes and so on, which are capable of being secured in counties like Surrey, but they're also pretty good for access to the private airport system. And if you've got really spectacular amounts of money, it doesn't matter because you can have a home there and you could also have a place in central London as well, which is what many people would do at the very, very top end of the wealth spectrum.
Why London? I mean, you alluded to some of the more legal framework questions, but I mean, it's amazing that people from all over. I've lived in London. It's a great place. It's fantastic. We know that. But what brings all these people there? What is the specificity of the place?
Well, you could say that superficially, at least, London doesn't really have anything that Paris doesn't. Is it so very different from Frankfurt? It's probably quite a bit different from somewhere like Hong Kong. And it is pretty different, although it's changing, from a city like New York, which would be another kind of key rival. But why London? Well, it's a combination of history. There's a sense of attachment or interest in the city because of its colonial heritage. So, that does lend itself to a certain kind of imaginary where people engage with the city, the symbolism of, the London buses, the London Bobby on the beat, the police. There's a symbolic quality to the city which people know even before they've kind of got there. So it has that kind of soft power in that sense. The culture of the city is seen to be pretty desirable as well, I would say. So people are very interested in a place being pretty tolerant. It's pretty safe. It's highly secure in terms of its financial services infrastructure, which makes it very, very popular in that sense. And it's a very open environment. So it's seen, at least in principle, to be a very democratic open space that it is possible to integrate oneself into. I don't think that's fully true. I think there's snobbery. I think there's racism. There's all kinds of things that go on that make that a more complex thing. But the city does function in a way that, just as it has done for the last 300 or 400 years, that you go to London in order to get a place at the table. In other words, to be part of the elite, one has to circulate in the spaces to try and find one's way into those kind of networks. And you can't do that if you live in Dubai solely and go on holiday to London. You can't do that from Geneva or Frankfurt or New York or whatever. You want to have a place in the city. So this does drive a lot of residential consumption where people are buying a house, which they maybe only occupy for something like 2 weeks, 6 weeks a year, which seems pretty obscene, of course, in a city which has massive problems in terms of overcrowding, people really struggling to access decent, affordable housing, and so on. And anyway, so we can go into the kind of politics of that. But what that does mean is that people are prepared to really pay millions, literally, to have a place that they can access to be part of this circuit. But not only to be part of that circuit, because of course, if you have so much money, you can have London, but you can also have New York and perhaps Mexico City and Moscow. You might have anywhere between 2 and 6 or more residences that you can access to be in the right place at the right time, depending on what's going on. So, the social circuit in terms of sporting, Formula One, say, perhaps horse racing, if that's your interest, polo, a whole range of pursuits. And then you've got the kind of private club system, which I think is less important than it used to be. Certain nationals will use, let's say, the restaurants and clubs of Mayfair and Knightsbridge in a way that the club system the private clubs would have operated in the 19th and early 20th century, which is kind of dying away a little bit. And so all of those things to come together to make a very distinctive social space as well as a physical space. So historically, one that is very different from New York, the verticality, the skyscrapers and so on. But, London has changed dramatically as well. So we know that, well, it will have changed because of the pandemic, but we know that roughly 500 or more new skyscrapers are at some stage of development in the city. The city has changed dramatically. And the signal change, of course, was the creation of the Shard just a few years ago, funded by Qatari wealth fund money, Qatari sovereign wealth fund investing all over London, making a whole series of portfolio investments in order that, once the natural gas runs out off Qatar, that it has these kind of investments that will deliver in the long term. So this high-rise residential and office landscape has emerges particularly along the corridor of the Thames, creating a fairly windswept, kind of quite problematic sort of landscape in which there is very little affordable housing, no public housing. Surprise, surprise. Even though that's supposed to deliver tens of thousands of residential units, none of that is really benefiting the ordinary or even reasonably wealthy Londoner. And so this raises really enormous questions about the politics of this, about who is being privileged, the sense that capital, that money is ruling the city, and also the sense that the political system and the planning system, so the way that the land market operates, works in a way that advantages people who already have plenty of money. Now, the argument in the converse of that, the argument against what I'm saying is that, look, after the last financial crisis, we would not have had this wonderful development activity. We wouldn't have had the Shard. We wouldn't have had all of this stuff if we hadn't had the capital of wealthy investors and the rich themselves to buy up a lot of this stuff. The problem being, if you're sitting there in an overcrowded, privately rented home in central London right now, is that really that sense of the sort of political spin on this, that this is lifting all boats, is really ringing hollow. That it does not really match the kind of reality that many, many hundreds of thousands of Londoners are really, really struggling here. And the struggle is not just about the poorest of the city. It's not about the most marginal. And we know that roughly, for example, 200,000 people have been displaced from public housing over the last decade, according to the research done by Loretta Lees, for example. We don't, even if we don't concern ourselves with the poorest of the poor in the city, and we know that, a quarter of the population of London counts as poor in that sense, but none of those people are being benefited. And it's really, I have to say, this is where my personal politics comes out, because I think it is a standing outrage that during a period of global capital circulation and excess, that the state and the city did not do more to claw back or to take a greater sense of contribution from wealthy developers, from the rich themselves, and say, look, we need to do this because we can only really legitimate what's happening here if we see alongside those towers the production of public housing, the production of affordable housing. In fact, the whole city falls down unless you do that stuff, because the people who are the cleaners, the people who service this wonderful, beautiful city can no longer afford to live and to work there. And so there's really quite a sense, I would say, of a pretty callous politics, a callous class politics. So we have had a government ostensibly of the left in control of London, but nationally of the right of centre, which has been very pro-development, very pro-market. Now we're in the pandemic phase, and this is even worse because we've started from a very low baseline where we know, for example, that minority, ethnic and poorer households have suffered way in excess of other people in the city because they are in more crowded, polluted, poorer quality accommodation. We know that people working in service sector employment, trying to keep the economy going, have really, really suffered. But fiscally, in terms of the money that the state has to dig us out right now, it's not there because, we haven't done enough to create a more level playing field in terms of taxation, in terms of the contribution of tech companies, tax avoiders, offshore launderers, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that's left us in very bad shape. And now my fear now would be that we're going into a new crisis. So we had the global financial crisis of a decade ago. Now we have a new crisis. How are we going to fund this? How are we going to dig our way out? And so we are seeing by necessity the chancellor of a right of centre government saying, we need to talk about wealth taxes. We need to talk about inheritance tax, all the kind of stuff that the Conservative Party would really doesn't want to go there, but is compelled to. Discussions in Europe and to some extent in the UK about a tax on the tech companies. So there's been a kind of compulsion to talk about stuff that was off limits. But I think what is more likely, because the other thing that's happening at the same time is we're seeing proposals for things like free ports, tax exempt spaces where you put your wine, where you put your art, as they do in Geneva, and who's that going to benefit? If that's your model for some kind of great economic boom that's going to sort of deliver for everybody, I think the evidence on that is incredibly sketchy. And what's way more likely is that that's just really another gift to those people who already have too much. I mean, in the context right now, the social politics of this is massive anger, that people at the margins, the poor, minority ethnic groups and so on, have suffered, have died during the pandemic. And what's the plan? Is it, free ports, low taxes, Singapore on Thames, let the development rip? Or is it something just a little bit more socially equitable and socially just? Now we have Conservative MPs representing some of the poorest parts of the UK following the last general election, who are saying, what's going on here? Who are you representing? I think there's maybe a bit of a naivety there. We know who they represent, and it's kind of big money. It flowed into politics. We've got people allegedly, I choose my words carefully, in this recent report about Russian involvement in the political system. We know that there are lords who have connections to Russian business and so on, and we tread quite gently around some of that stuff, and it's a delicate sort of set of questions. But in that sense that the city has been captured, that the capture isn't just through land and development and some kind of mainstream political thing, it's ideological as well. In other words, the ideas, the frameworks, the systems that we think through are infected by this idea that money lifts all boats, that there's something inherently good about having large numbers of wealthy people buying into the city. And I think, again, that's really, to say the least, really significantly being questioned right now.
If we talk about this plan, alternative plan, let's say, more sociable, more equitable plan, what do you think would have to be on there? And also maybe how could it be enforced? I remember you gave an example of how, in a different conversation, about how people came or went around these regulations by, instead of building verticality, they built into the ground when they were not allowed to build high and stuff like that. So can we expect that even if there were regulations, would they be adhered to, or how could they really be enforced?
Well, this is a really significant question, and I don't pretend that it's easy. So if we talk about tax, one of the standard responses to a discussion about tax is it's too complicated. If you change things, people will move their money offshore even more, that they can escape from the system or play the system in ways that they avoid, they evade, they work in ways that actually reduce the contribution to the government and so on. But fortunately, there are plenty of people out there who have really bright ideas about how you reform that system. And one of them is obviously that we begin to shut down and engage in national bilateral taxation arrangements, which include shutting down access to offshore. Or if people want to use offshore, that's fine, but they declare their full tax return and then still have to pay tax to the national government. So we have people like Thomas Piketty in France who is a very staunch pro-capitalist, but who would say the advantages to the wealthy and those people whose income comes from capital, from shares, from other corporate interests, well, we need to tax that much higher because the contribution currently is insufficient to make this system work properly. It's become loose, it's become baggy, it's not lean, it's not efficient. It encourages people not doing terribly innovative things, just giving money to shareholders and so on. Meanwhile, the Googles, the Amazons, etc. of this world go to great lengths to avoid taxation and so on. But there are things that we can do, and I think it's as social scientists, we're talking about social systems. We can do stuff with this. It's not something that's out there that cannot be interfered with in some way. So we know that tweaks to, for example, inheritance taxation will mean that people will try and give their kids money earlier on so that they avoid it and so on. But we can do things to challenge that. The real question in relation to things like taxation is, what is socially just? Let's start from that question and work our way through it. To take the planning system, there is another domain within which this form of city capture arises. Now, what could we be doing there? Well, we could be saying to developers, look, if you want to build, 35% of that, as some activists are saying in London, 35% should be affordable. So let's say that is an unavoidable commitment, rather than that, an elite developer comes along and says, look, if I put in some affordable housing here, these very wealthy people aren't going to want to live next to these people, and they certainly don't want to see public housing. That's just a complete no-no. We wouldn't be able to sell this stuff. So if we sell stuff cheaper within the development, our profit margins are simply not high enough. Now, the operating standard assumption of any private developer is the pursuit of a 20% profit margin. Very, very few sectors would say that's a reasonable, or it's a very, very high expectation. But there are plenty of developments in central London which operate or have achieved 100% or more profit margins. So what can we be doing in that space? Well, in terms of planning, we can be saying that, no, you don't get to buy your way out of that. To give a bit of money, a contribution to the local state, which also can be problematic. So what is known as planning gain, giving some money to the local authority who would hopefully build, let's say, some affordable housing. They haven't necessarily done that, and quite often it's very difficult to do that. But if you work with the assumption that land in the centre of London is worth so much money that there's no way that poorer people should be allowed to live there because they simply can't afford it, then you get this sort of Parisian style rich core, poorer suburbs, and a lack of diversity, which really starts to become socially dysfunctional. That politically and socially, it's not legitimate. It's highly problematic. So we have to say that we need to challenge the kind of market logic of a lot of this stuff, because if you pursue the market, there's people with so much money now who have condensed such enormous personal wealth that gives them profound power, the ability to buy whatever they want, including, some people would argue, forms of political influence, the ability to influence how the land market operates in the city core in ways that delivers more for capital than it does for people who really need homes. The other aspect that if we're to promote the social city, as I think I call it in the book, is that we could do with more investment into social housing. Now, even to suggest that would be seen as kind of ridiculous. Anyone on the political right or center would be saying this is a stigmatized, they've done their level best to kind of denigrate and defund public housing, and the last thing they're going to do is swing public subsidy towards public tenants. But we know that public housing delivers affordable, secure, and decent homes. We have award-winning examples where we can produce very high quality accommodation, and that really delivers. That completely breaks this circuit of people not being able to find decent, affordable homes. Now, on the upside of that, you could be saying, well, if you're a private developer, don't be too despondent about the fact that we want to fund public homes, because we want to pay you as developers to build this stuff. And right now there would be medium-sized and larger developers who would be very keen to be part of that form of public investment. And we know that construction activity has a massive boost to the macro economy. But the kind of economy that we live in is one in which we have a taxation holiday currently to encourage people to buy homes. We give people equity loans to 20%. The government will buy 20% of your home so that it costs you less. That has cost the government tens of billions of pounds. And so this idea that we can't give any form of subsidy to public housing, I think, highlights the kind of ideology. It highlights the way that ideas around market allocation of goods is becomes kind of blind to the obvious advantages of thinking in different ways. And there's a whole, there's a whole range of other things that we could be beginning to do in that kind of space, really.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that there are things that we can do, which is often the big question with these complex issues of inequalities and sometimes frustrating issues where power is involved, etc. Before we come to a close in our program, I'd like to ask you how you got interested in this subject in the first place. I mean, why do you think it's relevant to research these things?
That is a really good question. So I'll give a very, very short version of what is potentially a very long answer, which is to say that when I did my doctorate in London, in the very early 1990s, I was looking at how households were kicked out of their homes. They were displaced because of gentrification in the city. Now, at that point, I had to explain quite often to people what gentrification meant. It meant middle class and higher income people moving into the neighborhood, rents and so on rising so that people couldn't afford to live there anymore. Now we all kind of talk about gentrification, but in my research, I've moved from gentrification. I've looked at poverty quite often in cities, but I've also been interested in things like the rise of gated communities in the UK. And then I got to the point around about 10 years ago, and I thought that really we had no kind of impressions of neighborhood life in the city at the very top end. And quite often what happens is people say, well, why are we interested? Why would we be interested in the rich? They're not problematic, And my answer to that is that yes, they are in a sense. They're part of the problem. So let's disentangle how all these kind of components fit together, and what can we say about what it means for neighborhoods that are, enormous concentrations of very, very wealthy people, in the same way that we would problematize and talk about ghettoized poverty, segregation, and so on. Let's flip that on its head. Let's see what happens when we make connections between those very rich areas, the state, the local state, the planning system, the tax system, the mobility system, the way that people get around. How does that all relate to the poorest people? Is there a connection there? And I think the answer is, yes, in that sense. Yeah.
Rowland, thank you so much for giving us this running tour through London and the concentration of wealth, the effects it has on the society as a larger construction, on poor people, on power relations. So much more to think about there. We hope that you'll keep your walks through the cities and the neighborhoods, and maybe in Mexico City next year, we'll have
Hopefully.
some tours.
Yeah.
And look through the neighborhoods here. Thank you all for watching another episode of Futures Frame TV. If you like these topics, if you're interested in learning more about inequalities, please join us again next Saturday for another episode. And you're also welcome to subscribe to our channel, Traces.Dreams. I'm Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, and I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.